I want to speak with you this morning about this stole and about the most meaningful experience of Unitarian Universalism that I've ever been blessed with. To start out with, it was March of 2020, and I was driving home from my second job and listening to Colorado Public Radio. They were talking, of course, about the new novel coronavirus and a series of 2-week closures slated for public spaces. I could speak for an extended amount of time about exactly what I was feeling in that moment, but I think we've all been there. We've all experienced that. I took out my phone and I called up Mandy, who was the chair of my worship team at the time, who actually made this scarf. You see, she was a service knitter. We had a whole group of people at our congregation who would just sit and knit all the way through the service. And she made me this beautiful scarf with a chalice and a bass clef. So I called her up, and we talked for the first time about closing down the church. 2 weeks slowly rolled into what would become almost 2 years for many, including the church. As we sat at home, unable to work and longing for human connection, people got anxious. We were afraid. We were angry. We were forced to evaluate our whole lives in isolation, our jobs, our relationships, even our values. And so, when George Floyd, an unarmed black man, was killed by police in May of 2020, a lot of people were suddenly unburdened by oppressive work schedules and dying to live their values in action in a time when every day felt like the end of the world. I'm sure you remember demonstrations broke out across the country and even abroad in some places. And so I, too, called up my dear friend, the now Reverend Jen Simon, and we headed downtown together. It was then that this scarf became my stole. I wanted to be visible as a religious leader, but all of that, what Reverend Jonifer used to call the drag kit of the clergy, was locked away in the unused building across town. So this is what I wore. I want to warn here that there are some depictions that follow of police brutality. When we arrived downtown, there was already tear gas in the air. Our eyes stung. It was only 2 in the afternoon, and the protest was not only peaceful, but outright calm. We knelt in silence, stood in circles singing songs. All the while, all the police forces of the Denver metropolitan area were lined up in SWAT vests, wielding AR-15s and periodically rolling an armored SWAT car through the crowd. As we sang and chanted and marched, every 15 minutes or so, a tear gas canister was launched into the crowd. And as afternoon rolled into evening, the frequency increased until it was constant and loomed in white clouds rolling across the crowds. The message was clear: you may not challenge our institution. When I returned home, I can remember laughing that everything that I ate tasted spicy from the leftover tear gas on my lips and in my mouth. After dark, the real violence began. Rubber bullets and other paramilitary weapons were unleashed on the crowds in our absence. So, naturally, we returned the next day with all the more resolve. This went on for the next week, with increasing public scrutiny of the police, as well as an inevitable break in the nonviolence of the protesters, who vandalized the entire downtown area with messages reading, "Black Lives Matter," and "Say His Name." During the day, we marched under the BLM banner and closed streets and even an interstate once. We chanted and we sang and we tasted tear gas. And after a while, the protests started to slow down as their work began to see fruit. Injunctions were issued against the police forces, and some were even disbanded or reorganized. It was at this point that I got an email from the Colorado UUs for Racial Justice, asking if we should pen a letter of support for the protests. I can't really express how I felt at that moment, that a week into all of this, we're going to get an email that says, should we pen a letter of support? But I'd been there, Jen and I, the only two members of the UUs for Racial Justice who were BIPOC identified. We'd been there. We'd been grabbed and pushed by police officers. We'd been assaulted with weapons of the battlefield. And now it was the time to write a letter. So I let this fester for a day or so. I knew that it wasn't the time to say anything, and I just sat with this. I asked the Spirit for guidance. And then I wrote back, where were you? Where were you when we were marching, when we were kneeling, when we were being shot at? Isn't that the aim of this organization, to radically support the goal of racial equity? Is this really what you will do now? And I sense it. And the responses came pretty quickly. We need a meeting, and we want you to hold us accountable. We want you to hold us accountable. We need to talk. So I went ahead and called up Reverend Jen again, and we got some tacos. And we talked about this. We want you to hold us accountable. Whose responsibility is this, right? We have already been to these protests, we've already experienced, we've already been involved in the action. We want you to hold us responsible, our BIPOC members. And we decided on only one thing. So when the UURJ met via Zoom from our homes, we had only one ask. We will tell you what to do from now on, and you will do it. You will let us tell you what to do, because it is not our obligation to teach you how to do this, but it is your obligation to listen. And they agreed. And then we got some more tacos. But this time, it wasn't just us. The Reverend Angela Henderson, Pastor A.J. Blackwood, and Director of Religious Education Denard Blackwood all came forward and said, I heard about this little thing that happened, and I'm also a BIPOC religious leader, and I want in. So the table grew. And that first time, it was just a getting to know you. We talked about our backgrounds, our perspectives on racial justice work, and our lives. But the next time, it was Denard's fried chicken, and we had a proposal for the UURJ. We wanted 7 speakers, all BIPOC UU faith leaders, to speak on whatever they wanted to speak on, and each of the 7 churches of the Denver Boulder cluster would pay for 1 speaker. They were stunned, and the Zoom room was quiet, but we reminded them that they consented to lead only if they would follow, and the room said, yes, we did. Yes, we did. So the next dinner was tamales, and we came up with another defining element for our lecture series. Only BIPOC can speak. We would hold a space where white people could listen, but since this was in the era of all of the Zoom conversations, they could not use the chat box or raise hands. They could not ask follow-up questions. Only listen. BIPOC would have these options, as well as a private Q&A room after each speaker. And this caused a lot of discomfort. People said that we were discriminating against white people and that it wasn't UU to remove people's voices. But we were firm, saying that BIPOC people routinely exist in space where their voices are silenced. And this will be a space where BIPOC can speak openly to BIPOC and white people can listen, which is eventually exactly what we said as our prompt to our 7 speakers. Say what you want to say to other BIPOC UUs, knowing that you have a captive white audience. Anything your heart desires to put out there. So it was a series of these dinners that we selected 7 names: the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, Reverend Joseph Santos Lyons, Reverend Gordon Clay Bailey, composer and UU music director Sonder Choi, Reverend Summer Albayati, Reverend Clyde Grubbs, and the Reverend Julian Jamaica Soto. We arranged a series of dates and set up a technological migraine of broadcasting where BIPOC would attend a Zoom room that was then featured as a keynote speaker in a whole other Zoom room with no feedback features. We managed recordings and moderated the Q&A sessions. We got familiar with the faces in the rooms, and then we found ourselves at one final dinner saying, What now? We had a solid core of passionate participants and no more speakers. So, you probably guessed, we got tacos. So after a lot of discussion of possibilities, we decided to double down on the original ask. So now we wanted the congregations to fund a ministry for BIPOC UUs. We named it the Mountaintop, and we asked for each congregation to pledge into the ministry. In exchange, they would get a few sermons on racial justice per year. They could not critique the sermons, nor could they penalize the minister for their content. In fact, we wrote in the contract that the minister would be supervised by a local BIPOC minister and not by any one of the affiliate congregations. They would be primarily tasked with leading the mountaintop and secondarily tasked with providing worship that relayed the work of the mountaintop into their sanctuaries. And again, they said yes. And in fact, you can learn about the Zoom worship services of the Mountaintop at themountaintopuu.org as they continue to meet. You can also watch the speaker series as well, which is available for free. But this story isn't about a pat on the back to me or to my colleagues. It was truly the greatest blessing of my time in the ministry to participate at such a time with such talented people. But really, it's about the tacos. It's about the tacos. You see, we decided from day one in our planning that our guiding principle would be relationship first. That's the non-white perspective that we chose for our understanding of interdependence. We never showed up on a strict agenda, but we would always show up with food. And sometimes it took a few hours to really start co-creating. Sometimes we just were too worn out and we needed to be together and watch a few YouTube videos. And sometimes we had no inspiration and the ideas were falling flat. And so we sat and we broke bread and we continued to build relationship. That's the relational cost of justice. Fourth U is beginning our second interim ministry, and I'd like to invite you to make it about the tacos too. I sat in the listening sessions with Reverend Jonifer before his departure, and a lot of people felt a lot of anxiety over the state of the congregation. Some people felt abandoned. Some people felt that there was something wrong with us. But the truth is, this is what an interim is about. An interim ministry is a time when you walk with someone after a long and meaningful relationship to help you understand yourself, your needs, your passions, so that you can pick the next right partner. In these coming weeks, the board will be finalizing goals for the interim ministry, and I invite you not to think of these as goals for the minister, but as goals to get tacos. I invite you to explore and sit with all the possibilities that are open to you as a congregation, and to build relationship with one another and with Reverend Sam so that you can begin to co-create as well. It is the cost of justice. And so, that's why I'm standing here today in this scarf as a stole, and why UU is a slightly different place because of tacos. Thank you.